and welcome to today's event. My name is Rebecca and I work at Newcastle University within the NU Advancement team as our alumni officer. We are joined by two Newcastle University academics and staff members, our host Mark and our speaker Amanda. Professor of Planning at Newcastle University, Professor Mark Shucksmith, OBE, leads the Rural Lives Project, exploring the wellbeing of families in rural areas. With poverty and child poverty being a cross-cutting theme, Mark has worked in conjunction with Amanda across multiple platforms and discussions to highlight this important issue and will lead and join our dynamic Q&A later on. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Mark and over to you.
Thanks very much, Rebecca, and welcome everybody. My name is Mark Shucksmith. As Rebecca said, I'm Professor of Planning at Newcastle University and lead on the Rural Lives Research Project examining rural poverty. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to Why Ending Child Poverty is Everybody's Business, which sits within this year's 2021 Alumni Day of Action. Our theme for 2021 is social justice, an issue dear to my own heart. And we're this week exploring the topic of poverty, welfare, and social class. Today, I'm joined by Amanda Bailey, Director of the Northeast Child Poverty Commission and colleague at Newcastle University. The Northeast Child Poverty Commission is a stakeholder network that believes all children should have an equal chance in life and works to build public and political support for actions that improve the lives of the more than 1 in 3 children and young people growing up in poverty in Northeast England. Amanda can tell you much more about it. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to formally introduce you to Amanda as she outlines why tackling child poverty requires action from everybody, and not just a few activists. Amanda.
Thank you, and good evening to everyone, and thank you very much, Mark, for that introduction. As you've heard, I'm Amanda Bailey, the Director of the Northeast Child Poverty Commission, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to take place in this year's Alumni Day of Action programme, which, as Mark said, is themed around social justice with a particular focus this week on poverty, welfare and social class. I don't really know the extent to which people are coming at this issue as an entirely new issue this evening, or whether they're lifelong experts, but I look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments and questions towards the end of this event. And hopefully, is it possible to have the next slide, please? I was going to say, hopefully this session will prompt you to have a look at our website, where you could also sign up to receive our monthly e-newsletter or to follow our social media pages to get even more regular updates on our work. Next slide, please. So before speaking about why ending child poverty is everybody's business and the scale of this issue nationally, regionally in the Northeast, and more specifically in Newcastle, I thought it would be helpful to provide some quick background to the Commission's existence, mainly because this also sets the recent historical context for this evening's discussion and where we are now. As some of you might know, back in 2010, just over a decade ago, the Child Poverty Act was passed by the UK Parliament, and importantly, that was passed with cross-party support at the time. That legislation established in law 4 child poverty targets that were due to be met by 2020-2021, a year that's obviously now been and gone. It required the UK government to publish a regular UK-wide child poverty strategy, and it also required local authorities or local councils to publish local child poverty strategies for their area. As such, back in 2011, the Northeast Child Poverty Commission was established to help support the 12 local authorities in the Northeast region, that's from Northumberland down to Teesside, to develop their local child poverty strategies. However, as some of you may also be aware, the Child Poverty Act 2010 was effectively repealed or abolished in 2016 by another piece of legislation, the Welfare Reform and Work Act, which means that England is now the only part of the UK not to have a national child poverty strategy. And it also means there's now no statutory duty for either the UK government or local councils in England to measure, set targets or take action to reduce child poverty, which is something I'll return to later. But obviously, as I'm here today, despite the repeal of these duties, the Northeast Child Poverty Commission continues to exist. Next slide, please. So as was set out earlier, I thought it'd be helpful to explain that the North East Child Poverty Commission is not a charity. We're not a formally constituted body, but we are a stakeholder network of people from different organisations and different sectors across the region who all have a combined commitment to tackling child poverty in the North East. And you can see from the slide that includes local authorities, children and youth charities, the wider VCS sector, housing organisations, public health, academics, schools and education, social work and the faith community. And our overarching aim is to provide a strong regional voice to raise awareness of the issue of child poverty in the North East and to work collaboratively to tackle the problem. And as you can see the logo on the top right hand of the screen, we're funded by a grant from an organisation called the Millfield House Foundation, which supports a small number of organisations in the region that undertake policy work with the aim of reducing poverty and inequality in the North East. Next slide, please. So you may be asking yourselves why I'm speaking at this Newcastle University event for alumni. And since 2019, the North East Child Poverty Commission has been hosted by, but is independent of Newcastle University as part of the university's commitment to social justice and its wider engagement and place strategy. And we remain very grateful for the support that we've received both from Newcastle as an institution, but also to individual colleagues across the university who helped to make the Commission's activities possible. I'm aware this slide is a bit busy, but it does give you a flavour of some of the work that the university has helped to facilitate since we've been hosted here, whether that's a regional conference that we held at the Great North Museum just before the outbreak of COVID-19, the reports and briefings that we published that the university has helped to support, lectures that have been held as part of the Insights public lecture series, and also having access to academics such as the public health professor Claire Bamborough, who you can see on the bottom right hand corner there, presenting some of the findings of her research to Commission members. Next slide, please. And what are we talking about when we're discussing child or family poverty in the UK and its causes? There is a view that this should be about comparing the material circumstances of children growing up, for example, in Newcastle or Sunderland, to those in the least developed countries in the world, or it should be about comparing the experience of children in Middlesbrough today with that of children growing up in Middlesbrough maybe decades ago. There's also, thankfully, a minority view that whilst families have the absolute bare minimum required to survive, child poverty doesn't exist in this country in 2021. However, as some of you watching may know, back in 1979, the sociologist and a founder member of the National Child Poverty Action Group, Peter Townsend, came up with this definition of child poverty or poverty, which explains that it's a relational concept and an inability to fully participate in the society to which people belong. I think this definition is always useful to refer back to, particularly when thinking about how growing up in poverty can marginalise and stigmatise young people and not being able to fully participate in childhood in the way that we'd want for all children. Next slide, please. So the North East Child Poverty Commission, we share that view that I've just shared with you on the previous slide. And we also believe that poverty is primarily a structural problem, not the fault of individuals or people's characteristics or so-called deficits. And the defining feature is families not having enough resources to meet their needs, which in turn restricts their choices, their opportunities, and their ability to participate fully in society. Next slide, please. And what does child poverty look like in the UK, and more specifically then here in the North East? Well, despite no longer having a legal requirement to do so, the government does, or the Department for Work and Pension does still produce annual data for what is known as relative child poverty after housing costs. So that is children living in households with an income of less than 60% of the UK median household income after housing costs have been taken into account. And that's the preferred measure of most organisations working in this field. Those figures are published every March, and on the latest available figures, which were published this March, but which you'll see actually cover the year 2019-20, there were 4.3 million children living in poverty in the UK. That's relative poverty after housing costs. That equates to 31% of all children in the country, or if it makes it easier to think about, 9 in a classroom, every classroom of 30. And it's also an increase of 200,000 on the year before and 700,000 since 2012. I think it's also really important to think about the fact that some children are much more likely to be in poverty than others. And nationally, we know that, for example, 47% of children living in households with 3 or more children are in poverty. That's up from 36% a decade earlier. We know that it's 46% of children from Black, Asian, minority ethnic families are in poverty compared to 26% of white British children. And again, 49% of lone parent families, 34% of children in families with the youngest child under 5, although that rises to 46% in the North East. There was some work published this week by the Nuffield Foundation on that very specific issue. 37% of children in families where someone has a disability. And apart from the figure around the youngest child under 5, frustratingly, we don't have that level of breakdown or more granular level of data at a regional or even local level. And you'll also note that the time lag on the statistics, which means that it will be some time before we have the official figures of the impact of COVID-19 on child poverty, won't be until March next year that those are published. But I think crucially, given some of the political debate around this issue, and particularly in the last week or the last few weeks around universal credit, we know that across the country, the overwhelming majority, 75% of children who are living in poverty pre-pandemic were from working households. That is, that they have at least one parent or carer in work, which reflects the really huge increase in insecure, low-pay, precarious work that has been a really defining feature of the last decade, sadly. Next slide, please. And what does the picture look like in our region? That is the 12 local authorities of the North East. While regional child poverty figures are based on a 3-year rolling average of children living in relative low income after housing costs, and the most recently available data, again published by the DWP in March, shows that in the North East, in the 3 years up to 2019-20, an average of 37% of all children and young people were growing up in poverty. That's before the pandemic. That's the second highest rate in the country, just behind London. And it's also reached a rate pre-pandemic that we haven't seen in the region or indeed the rest of the country since the late 1990s. Most concerningly for our region, the North East also experienced the UK's steepest increase in child poverty in the 5 years from 2014-15, which means that child poverty in the region has risen from being just below the UK average at 26% to the second highest of any regional nation at 37% in half a decade. Of course, as I've said, none of these figures take into account the impact of COVID-19 yet, as we just don't have that official data yet. But the picture is quite clearly likely to have got worse given the devastating impact that we know the pandemic has had on family incomes and living standards for many, many people. Next slide, please. I know this next slide isn't the easiest to read, but I think it's really important to see the table in entirety to appreciate or fully appreciate the scale of the challenge we face in the region. It's based on analysis of DWP data that's published each year by academics at Loughborough University on behalf of the National End Child Poverty Coalition. And this is a table of the 20 local authorities across the whole of the UK, which experienced the steepest recent increases in child poverty in that 5-year period from 2014-15 onwards. It's important to emphasise this is not a table of the areas with the highest rates of child poverty, but those that have seen the biggest rate of growth in that time period. And you can see that the North East local authorities are highlighted in purple. And what will clearly jump out at you is that all 12 North East local authorities are at the top of this table, with Newcastle right at the top, having experienced a 12.8 percentage point increase over that 5 years, compared with a UK-wide increase of 2 percentage points. Next slide, please. So what are the reasons for this particularly steep pre-pandemic increase in the North East in recent years? In the report I just mentioned, published by Loughborough University on behalf of the NPAD Child Poverty Coalition, this is cited that they think it's likely to be influenced in particular by the presence in the region of a large proportion of low-paid workers who had only just been above the poverty line and have been pushed below by the freeze in their in-work benefits. And that refers, for example, to cuts in the value of universal credit, the introduction of the 2-child limit in 2017, and things like freezes and sub-inflationary increases to child benefit, which has meant that child benefits has lost at least 23% of its value since 2010. Next slide, please. The challenge of low paid work and the limited opportunities that work provides for a progression or a route out of poverty in the North East has also previously been highlighted by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. You can see there that that's a very specific issue in the North East, that it's harder to progress out of poverty through work because of the prevalence of low paid work in the region. Next slide, please. But also further concern and almost perennial concern for the North East is the consistently higher levels of unemployment that we've had in the North East in the years leading into the pandemic. Particularly pre-pandemic, we regularly had the highest rate of unemployment of anywhere in the UK. And you can see from this graph that towards the end of 19, so before COVID-19 took effect, our region had almost double the UK-wide percentage of children in household where no adult was in work. And also that gap has been growing quite steeply since 2017. So to recap, we have a combination in the region of higher unemployment and a greater prevalence of low paid work, which means that the cuts to our social security system that have taken place over the last decade, I think, have disproportionately impacted families both in and out of work in the North East. And of course, all at a time when funding for the services that children, young people and families use has also been very significantly reduced. Next slide, please. And if we dig a bit further down into the figures, we saw earlier that the city of Newcastle as a whole has experienced the steepest growth in child poverty of anywhere in the UK over the last 5 years before the pandemic. And this graph shows how the 3 different Newcastle parliamentary constituencies have fared. That is the areas that are represented by members of parliament, and also in relation to the rest of the UK. And in line with the rest of the North East, you can see that Newcastle North constituency, I think it's the purple line, and Newcastle East, the blue line, had a child poverty rate that was below the UK average previously, but now are both above this, whilst Newcastle Central started some way above the UK average and has also seen a steep increase over the 5 years to being well above that point now. Next slide, please. And of course, as that last graph alludes to the challenges with using regional-wide child poverty figures or even local authority-wide child poverty data, as it masks the true picture within different localities and communities, because as well as the enormous inequalities that exist between the North East and the rest of the country, there are also huge chasms within the North East itself and even within towns and cities within the region. I need to emphasise that this chart is slightly different to the others that I've used so far, as it's the only one that uses relative child poverty before housing costs have been taken into account. And that's because it's not possible to make robust estimates of after housing costs child poverty at what's known as a ward level. That's the areas represented by local councillors. But this is a chart of the 3 wards with the highest rates of child poverty before housing costs in Newcastle and the 3 wards with the lowest rates of child poverty. And you note that I've had to change the left axis to incorporate this. The previous graph started at 15%, this one starts at 0. But it shows the changes over time in those 3 wards with the highest rates and those 3 with the lowest rates. And you will note that whilst the 3 wards with the lowest rates, South Jesmond, North Jesmond and Gosforth, have seen either a slight increase or even remained static, the 3 wards with the highest rates, Elsick, Arthur's Hill and Wingrove, started off from a high point and have experienced a really steep increase over that time. Next slide, please. So what do all these statistics and figures mean for children, young people and families in the North East in terms of everyday impacts? We know, for example, that the region, we have the highest proportion of pupils eligible for free school meals, and actually that figure has been sharply increasing over the last 18 months as a result of the pandemic. We know that children in the North East have, the highest proportion of children living in low income and material deprivation. And pre-pandemic, children in the North East were most likely of anywhere in the country to be living in families with no or little savings to shield them from economic shocks, which clearly, given the impacts of the last 18 months, is particularly concerning. Next slide, please. I think I wanted to say at this point, given how depressing much of this presentation is, that we all know that the North East, and anyone who was a student at university at Newcastle knows that the North East is a fantastic region to live, work, study, do business, invest in, with really huge potential and incredible assets, not least the people who live here. And we should also want every child and young person in our region to be able to benefit from everything the North East has to offer, to be able to grow up not just healthy and secure, but having the best start in life, able to fully participate and thrive in education, in extracurricular enrichment and activities, to pursue the things they love, whether that's at home or with their friends, and with exciting futures ahead of them. But we also know that growing up in poverty makes that type of inclusive, ambitious, exciting childhood much more difficult. And I think this slide speaks for itself in terms of the day-to-day impacts of growing up in poverty, whether on friendships and the likelihood of being bullied or being excluded or marginalised and left out, on the constant stress, uncertainty and insecurity for families and children, and crucially, as I said, on children's ability to enjoy their childhoods and achieve their aspirations. Next slide, please. We also know that not only does growing up in poverty make that type of inclusive childhood much more difficult, it can have hugely damaging and indeed lifelong effects on infant mortality, on children's cognitive skills, their social and emotional development, physical health, mental well-being, educational outcomes, employment prospects, life expectancy, and indeed their likelihood of being in poverty as an adult. And as the quote from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation suggests, it wastes people's potential, and it clearly also limits children and young people's potential, which I think in turn is holding our region and our country back. Next slide, please. So what is to be done? Well, we are firmly of the view that the overwhelming majority of policy levers available to tackle child poverty, certainly in England, still lie with the UK government. And so alongside a large number of other organisations that make up the End Child Poverty Coalition, we're calling for the government to put reducing and then ending child poverty at the heart of its plans for the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, with a new cross-government, comprehensive, joined-up child poverty strategy. We think this should include the reintroduction of ambitious income-related targets against which to measure progress, and we need a Secretary of State in Cabinet responsible for overseeing this work and being accountable for that work. It should have a relentless focus on the root cause of child poverty, inadequate family incomes and raising family incomes. Next slide, please. And that has to include a strong social security system that both prevents and reduces poverty and provides the lifeline or safety net that we all need when facing difficult times. That's obviously been in the headlines in the last few weeks or so in relation to universal credit, and we may come on to discussing that. It should also include growing the availability of good work and removing employment barriers, action to tackle major fixed costs such as housing and childcare, which have been growing exponentially for many families. But we also need things like long-term transformative investment in the service that we know children and people and families use, which we think should be targeted but universal, so that they build that sense of social solidarity. And because the world has moved on since the country last had a child poverty strategy, it clearly needs to involve a comprehensive joined-up digital inclusion strategy, given the impacts of digital exclusion on families and their ability to participate fully in society. Next slide, please. And given, I hope by now, it's clear why I think ending child poverty is everybody's business, what actions can individuals and organisations take? And I apologise that most of this list is probably more focused on those who are watching this event from within the United Kingdom and potentially also within the North East. But I think that one of the single most important things you can do is contact your MP, your elected representative, and ask them to join us in demanding a new comprehensive cross-government child poverty strategy, as they need to know that this is a priority for their constituents. You could also contact your local council or local councillors about what they're doing to prevent and reduce poverty in your area, albeit within the constraints that they are now operating in. Does your employer or business, if you have one, pay the real living wage to your staff? And if you do, are you accredited with the Living Wage Foundation? That's a really important step that organisations can take. There are obviously countless charities and community organisations working tirelessly across the regions to support children and families living in poverty. And we know that their work will be more important than ever as we head into the winter and the challenges facing low-income families increase. That's through the cuts to universal credit, the end of furlough, rising food and energy bills. So I'd look into supporting that. And if you provide services to local families or children and young people, have you considered how accessible and inclusive they are for those on the lowest incomes? Or do you need to do something like poverty proofing them, which you could do with the support, for example, of one of our members, the charity Children North East. Next slide, please. And to end, because I always think it's valuable to end on an optimistic note, I wanted to leave you with these thoughts, that there's nothing inevitable or acceptable about child poverty in one of the largest economies in the world. And indeed, we know from relatively recent history that child poverty is highly policy responsive. Indeed, whilst our region, as I said, had experienced the biggest rise in child poverty since 2013 in the years before the pandemic, we actually saw the biggest fall in child poverty in the years between 1999 and 2013, which demonstrates what can be done with political will and drive and commitment to tackle it. And as Louisa McGeehan said on this quote, I think tackling child poverty is the best long-term investment the UK can make in its future prosperity, which I think clearly makes ending it everybody's business. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for such a thought-provoking talk and for allowing the alumni community to discover the key issues around children in the northeast of England and beyond. It's a really important issue that I'm surprised there isn't much more interest and action being taken. We'll now move into our live Q&A, and I invite those who wish to ask a question or comment to do so in our Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We've already got a few questions submitted. Some were in advance, and there's a few which have just come up today. So let's begin with the questions that have been asked today. First questioner, his name was Farid from Azerbaijan, and he's asked, what are the four targets which were set in the 2010 legislation? And I know one of those was for halving child poverty. Was it by 20? You'll know it better than me, Amanda.
It was for halving child poverty. So originally, the last Labour government set a commitment. It was actually in 1999 to end child poverty, and it was set out that this would be a 20-year task, hence the 2020 target, and that was then legislated for in 2010 by the Child Poverty Act. And there were four different measures that were included in that legislation. One was in relation to relative poverty, and actually it talked about ending child poverty, but it was to have a certain percentage of children living, less than a certain percentage living in relative poverty. So that's in relation to other people in society today. Then there's something called absolute poverty, which sounds like it's in relation to destitution, but actually it means comparing people's incomes today with their relative child poverty line of 10 years ago in 2010. And then there are a couple of other measures around what's known as persistent poverty, because clearly that's an issue that some children may live in poverty for short periods, whereas others may live in persistently, and there are different issues around that and outcomes. So persistent poverty is whether you have lived in poverty for 3 out of the last 4 years. And then there's also a measure around low income and material deprivation. So I can share the specific percentages because I can't remember them off the top of my head. And they weren't, whilst the government talked about eradicating child poverty, it wouldn't have gone that far, but it was at least setting a trajectory and a clear ambition of where they wanted to get to by 2020.
Thanks, Amanda. The second question that's come up is one which I think we can let you answer during answering other questions. So I won't put it directly. It's asking, is the Conservative government the main reason for poverty? But I think as we go through different issues, that will become more apparent. But I wanted to go to the third question, which is another factual one, just to sort of clear the factual questions out of the way. And that's just, what is the median UK income against which poverty is measured? I know it changes every year, of course.
Yeah, And I'll again share this data if the information sent out, but the UK median household income is equivalised. So it will depend on your family size, because obviously your costs as a family are different depending on your family size. And so there isn't a sort of fixed rate, and then anyone who falls below that is classed as living in poverty. It will depend on the number of adults in the household plus the number of children. So the rates are slightly different. And again, it's different for before housing costs and after housing costs. I think it's also important to emphasise that 60% level, that there will be some children living just below that, but there are others who are living well below that. And actually, one of the other concerns is that the number of children living in what's known as deep poverty has been increasing, so that the children who are well below the 60% line has been increasing too.
I wanted to so basically it's much more, it sounds like a simple question, but it's very complicated to answer it directly because of equivalisation. I wanted to ask one of the questions that had come beforehand, which was about the pandemic, and asking, did the pandemic in the UK create any new trends or any worrying developments within child poverty that maybe aren't shown in those statistics yet that you've got there?
So as I said, the official DWP figures won't come out till March. However, there are I describe it as real-time data that we can track to see the impact on families. So one I referred to was the free school meals figures. As I said, the North East pre-pandemic already had the highest proportion of pupils eligible for free school meals. And we've also seen the steepest increase of pupils eligible for free school meals over the last year. So we've gone from a high rate to and increasing at a faster rate than other parts of the country. And I think that's a particular concern, because we did a piece of research recently with the Child Poverty Action Group and Children North East about free school meals in the region, which found that because the eligibility threshold for free school meals is so low, so stringent, that actually 1 in 4 children living in poverty in the North East aren't eligible for free school meals because it's so low. So the fact we've seen that really steep increase in eligibility is concerning, because you have to be very poor to be eligible for free school meals. And there are other figures around, for example, universal credits. We've seen huge increases in the number of families eligible for universal credit and claiming that, including the number of families with children. So there are things that we can see where there have been impacts. And I think some of that's still we haven't seen the full impact, because obviously the furlough scheme is still operational, but is due to end at the end of the month. So it's not clear what effect that will have on unemployment rates in the region quite yet. So things are still kind of panning out in terms of the overall impact, but clearly there has been a very significant effect on family incomes, and both the number of people living in poverty, but also the level of hardship experienced by people who are already living below the poverty line.
And one of the things which relates very much to that, which is in the news all the time at the moment, and you alluded obliquely to it a few times in your talk about the high profile of these issues at the moment, is the imminent planned £20 a week cut to universal credit and working tax credit. Of course, that £20 a week extra came in as a temporary measure during the pandemic and will have cushioned child poverty a lot, I guess, during the COVID pandemic. But that cut now, there are a lot of people modelling or doing calculations of what it's going to mean to child poverty now. I think I saw an estimate of an extra 200,000 children in poverty as if that cut goes ahead. Do you want
yes, that's right. And I think the Joseph Ramsey Foundation have done quite broad geographical analysis of the impact, which shows clearly that it will disproportionately impact families with children, and particularly families with children in the North East, because 46% of all families with children in the North East will be affected by that cut, because 46% of all families with children are in receipt of either universal credit or working tax credit. I think it's also important to highlight again that, that cut, the increase was made last year, I think, as a tacit admission that the universal credit rate wasn't sufficient or adequate for people to make ends meet. And in the Chancellor's own words, he said he wanted to strengthen the safety net. And that's right, that he did that. You know, we should have a safety net that is a genuine safety net for families facing difficult times, but that shouldn't just be the case during a pandemic. Families face difficult times all the time, whether that's through ill health or injury or bereavement, or you know, crises happen all the time, and things that you can't plan for happen all the time, and we should always have a strong safety net to deal with those things. So that cut will have a particularly disproportionate impact on the North East. As I said, nearly half of all families with children, but also of the people receiving universal credit in the North East, we know that 59% are either already in work or they're not currently able to work, and the government's recognised that. So that I think there's been a bit of sort of discussion around, we just need to move people into work, or they need to work a couple of more hours a week. You know, the large majority of people who are receiving universal credit in the region are either already in work and doing everything that's being asked of them, or they're not able to work. That's the challenge with the argument that the government's making at the moment.
Yes, and there's been a lot of people pointing out in the last few days that because of the taper and other costs, you probably need to work about 9 extra hours a week to get £20 a week. I want to ask you one or two of the questions that have just come up on the Q&A. One is about, does child poverty lead to child labour? And what should be done to prevent that? I guess that's a different question, which would be maybe different in different countries.
I can't answer for other countries, I'm afraid, because I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on that, or even an expert on the issue in the North East. Clearly, we have legislation in the UK around child labour, but then there's always that added pressure on families where, you know, if you have younger people to take jobs, which means then perhaps you're not able to fully focus on your education or your studies, because, you know, it's more helpful to have someone bringing in additional income into the family. But I can't pretend to speak for the situation in other countries or being an expert around that, I'm afraid.
Got another 3 questions here, and I'm going to read out the first one because it's quite long and quite complicated, but it's basically about education as a route out of poverty. It's said that education is the way out of poverty in the long term. Peter Langley, who's asked the question, his concern is that the whole education process is only aimed at academic students. The many children who cannot pass academic exams already know in primary school and have given up by the time they reach secondary school. This is a complete waste. What can be done about making education more relevant to all children?
I think that's an argument I've heard for decades now. I think we often hear about, you know, that some groups of children are not academically suited, and clearly the government are doing work around, you know, apprenticeships and vocational education. I think my concern would be that we already are putting barriers in place to children and young people, whether they're academic or not, with things that go beyond the school gates. And I think many of the challenges facing schools in our region are actually way beyond a school's ability to influence or improve, because actually we know that one of the single biggest, if not the biggest, determinant of educational attainment is family income. And there's not a huge amount that schools can do around that. There are things that schools can do about that in terms of ensuring, for example, that every family that is eligible for free school meals is claiming them, because that then provides, you know, a huge amount of support for low-income families, but also ensuring that families are aware of what other support may be available in their local area and making sure that they are receiving everything that they're entitled to. So there are things that schools can do, but I think certainly in the North East, one of the major challenges facing schools in our region is the socio-economic disadvantage, and the fact that already puts a massive barrier or hurdle in front of many young children and young people, regardless of whether they're academic or not.
And I'm sure you'd want to acknowledge and make other people here aware of the work that organisations like Children North East have done in trying to poverty-proof the school day and that sort of thing. I'm going to go on to a question that I can't resist, given my own interests in rural poverty, and it's from Jane Glass, who thanks you for your presentation. Are the child poverty trends you describe in Newcastle mirrored in rural Northumberland, where living costs are known to be higher? Do rural children need different support and or require different calls to action?
Sorry, I thought you meant you couldn't resist answering.
No, I'm trying to stop myself answering it. So let you have a go first. I'll have a go afterwards if.
Yeah, I mean, in Northumberland, I think Northumberland is interesting just in terms of how enormous it is geographically, the demographics of it, in terms of the large number of population that lives in a very small proportion of the county, and obviously I talked about poverty being the main driver being family income that's not adequate, but clearly in many parts of Northumberland that then leads to other challenges in terms of if you don't have access to private transport and the public transport system is not adequate. And then that limits your opportunities in terms of what's available for work or education. But yes, very much Northumberland, there are huge disparities in Northumberland in terms of being some of the wealthiest and least disadvantaged parts of the North East, and then other parts which very much not so. So yes, that those issues are mirrored, but then compounded by the challenges of living in rural and also coastal communities as well.
Thanks. I'm not going to entirely resist answering. I'm just going to add something very briefly because it's your show, really. But I just wanted to add that low pay is often more persistent in across rural Britain than urban Britain, even though incomes are maybe a bit higher. And access to advice, help, and support is further away, often centred in towns, and trying to access it digitally, especially when the universal credits essentially digital system. It's very difficult when there are areas that don't have broadband, never mind the cost, lack of formal childcare, stigma and visibility in small communities. But it is your show, so I'll stop myself and resist going any further. Thanks for answering that one. I've got a question here from Satoru Kobayashi. The fact that minority ethnic children tend to be living in poverty is interesting. Do these children of minority ethnic origins in poverty tend to have extreme political thinking of ultra-right or communism or Islamic terrorism?
I don't know. I'm sorry.
No, it's not something that we come across in relation to trying to address poverty very much. So we'll leave that. There's also a question again by the person who asked our first question, Farid from Azerbaijan, which I think we may not be able to address either. He's asking really about what strategy should develop in countries designed to tackle child poverty. You were saying already that your expertise is really about UK, so yeah. Say something on that if you want. Or
again, I'm not going to answer a question that I can't. I don't think I could add anything to Farid. Probably knows more about this than I do. So
absolutely, no, that's what I thought. So there's a question from Sue Wilson. A London friend said she would like to help a disadvantaged Newcastle family. Other than pointing her to various charities, is there any channel more specific that I could direct her to?
I guess it depends what the issues are and what their position is in terms of whether they have sought advice before. I mean, there are many organisations that do provide all sorts of advice, whether that's, for example, Citizens Advice Newcastle, they may wish to make contact with, who could then also direct them to other forms of advice and support and around what's available. But without knowing the specific circumstances, I'm not sure. But if Sue wants to contact me directly, I can try and connect her with relevant people if that's helpful.
That's great, thank you. Another one of the questions we had in advance was, does child poverty follow a north-south divide in the UK? You've presented information about London and the northeast, but I suppose this is a more general question about the north-south divide.
Yes, I mean, there are higher rates of child poverty in the northeast, obviously, Yorkshire and Humber, and the northwest, but also in the Midlands, particularly Birmingham. And when I talked about the areas that had the highest rates of child poverty, they are largely London boroughs and Birmingham areas, with just 2 areas in the northeast, Newcastle and Middlesbrough, included in that top 20. But what I think is interesting is the very different reasons for the northeast and London being the top highest. Obviously, in London, it's around housing costs, childcare costs, whereas in the northeast, it's around low pay, unemployment, and not so much those other costs. And actually, what I find really interesting is the interplay between those two things, because one of the reasons London has really high housing costs and other costs is the level of demand, because of perhaps other people moving from areas of the country where there are less employment opportunities or less well-paid opportunities. And that obviously then reflects why the situation is so high in the northeast. You have fewer better paid jobs and higher unemployment. So there's almost an interplay between those two things, but it's certainly not just a north-south issue. London, as I said, has the highest rate of child poverty in the country, but for different reasons to the northeast.
Thank you. I'm just going to tell everybody we're coming towards the end. So if anybody wants to ask a last question, this is your chance to type it in. In the meantime, I've got a question that I had while you were doing your presentation, which was fascinating. In one of your slides, you called for targeted but universal investment. So I just wondered what you meant by targeted but universal investment. Could you explain that a little and unpack it a bit?
Yeah, so we'd think around things like family or community hubs, which there are a good example of an initiative like that which did happen in the UK. Sure Start, namely, where families, they're open to anyone, and therefore they're not stigmatized or seen as just for certain people, but actually the support is also sort of communicated or marketed to those on lower income, perhaps more than it would be to everyone else. So they're a universal service that's there for everyone and part of every childhood, but also specifically targeted at those families who may need that support more. You might also include, for example, the holiday activities and food programme that's been running over the summer holidays. Currently, that's only really available to children who are eligible for free school meals. But would that be perhaps better to have that as a thing that's open to everyone, but perhaps located just in those areas where we know free school meal eligibility is higher than others, but it's not badged as being just for children on free school meals. That's 2 examples. So but to build that kind of sense of, as I said, social solidarity, and the fact that those kind of support services are available to all families and they all feel invested in it, but they're perhaps targeted at particular families or communities who may need that support more.
Thanks. Just on the subject of free school meals, I think I've heard that 1 in 4 North East children living below the UK poverty line are not currently eligible for free school meals. Is that true? And why is that? What can we do about that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we did a piece of research with the Child Poverty Action Group and Children North East on this specific issue. We wanted to look at because we have such a high rate of free school meal eligibility, and we found that 1 in 4 children living below the poverty line are not eligible because the threshold, frankly, is so low, and effectively is an out of work benefit because it's so low. But that then has knock-on impacts because eligibility for free school meals is the kind of proxy for disadvantage within the education system. So that then leads to pupil premium funding, whether you can access things like the holiday activities and food programmes. Some schools provide, or councils provide, support with school uniform costs, for example, but only for children eligible for preschool meals. So by having that really narrow definition, it automatically cuts out other families who may be just above the eligibility threshold from accessing a whole range of support. One of the things we called for in that research was to extend eligibility to all families in receipt of universal credit, because the other thing we had concerns around is the complexity of the system. And actually, there are many families who don't claim or don't really understand what they're eligible for, whereas if it was more simplified, that would make it easier. And that's one of the other things we found as well, is that we estimated that 11% of children who are eligible aren't claiming the support for a variety of different reasons. So we're working with schools. We're actually going to be doing an event towards the end of this month with Child Poverty Action Group, Children North East and Schools North East, for schools in the region, about how they can increase their uptake, but also improve the free school meal experience for children receiving that support.
Great, thanks. I think we've got time for one quick question and one answer, one quick answer. Poverty can be deeply hidden. For example, a family who on the surface seem fine but heavily in debt or have lost income suddenly. What can you do to help a friend or family member who you think could be experiencing this?
As I said before, I would advise going to, there are many sort of specialist advice organisations who really can help, whether that's Citizens Advice, or some local authorities still have a welfare rights advice service, to really get specialist advice, basically to ensure that they are receiving everything they're entitled to, because we know that that's not always the case, but also to get specialist debt advice, and advice around income maximisation, and also about understanding how they prioritise their debts, for example, because some debts are more important to pay off than others. And so I'd really strongly advise them going to a specialist advice service.
That's great. Thanks very much. There's another question come in, but we've run out of time, I'm afraid. That was a really, really informative and interesting set of questions and set of answers. Thank you to all those who submitted a question today. And as our event draws to a close, I'd like to thank you all for joining today. If we were unable to answer any of your questions, we'll endeavour to connect with you post-event to continue such discussions and remarks. If you've enjoyed today's session, the recording will be available on the Newcastle University Alumni YouTube account in the coming days. You can share that with your networks, and don't forget to visit the Alumni Day of Action webpage and explore our research within this area and sign up for future events. But for now, I'm going to hand you back to Rebecca, who will highlight some of the key events in the next week we think you might like. Take care, and thank you once again.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Amanda, for your extremely interesting talk and during the live Q&A. I think we've all learned quite a lot this evening and food for thought. Without further ado, I think it is time to let you all go and enjoy your evening, morning or lunch, wherever you may be across the world. But our Alumni Day of Action continues for a further 3 weeks. With lots of different and exciting events. So if you would like to attend anything, please visit www.ncl.ac.uk/Alumni Day of Action, and there's still time to register. So thank you once again for joining us, and I hope you have a lovely day wherever you are. Thank you.